It started with a knock I didn't expect and a tone I didn't like. I opened the door to see 3 people standing there, firm in posture. Their faces set with the kind of cold confidence that tells you they've already made up their minds. One of them, the tall man in the center, didn't waste a second before saying, "We're giving you until Sunday to move out." I stood there confused for a moment, because I had no idea who they were or what they were talking about. The woman beside him held up a folded letter, her fingers shaking only slightly. "It's all explained here," she said. "We've decided we're not comfortable having you live here anymore." I took the letter and read it right there in front of them. It was a typed-out message full of vague reasons, claims about disturbances, behavior, even energy. They wrote it like I was some kind of pest that had overstayed my welcome. What made it all more surreal was that they were calm about it, like they were doing me a favor, like I should just nod and thank them for the extra few days before being forced to leave my own place. I folded the letter slowly, looked each one of them in the eye, and just said, "Is that so?" They nodded. "Sunday," the tall one repeated. I closed the door gently, went to the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of water. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't even offended. I was just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes right before a storm. I stood there thinking, not about what they said, but about what they didn't know. Because the truth was something they hadn't even considered. The truth was, I was the landlord. They thought they were dealing with just another tenant. They thought I was someone with no power, no say. Maybe I dressed too casually. Maybe I was too polite. Or maybe they just didn't care to ask the right questions. Whatever the case, they were in for a rude awakening. Because I didn't just live here, I owned this place. Every brick, every pipe, every piece of flooring. My name was on the deed, and they were the ones renting rooms under a temporary agreement. I sat down at the table, pulled out my phone, and looked through the lease agreements I had drafted months ago. All signed by them, all legal. I read through the clauses again, especially the ones they had clearly ignored. No subletting without approval. No alterations to common areas. No threats or intimidation to other tenants or the owner. They had broken all 3. And now they were trying to turn it around on me. I started taking notes, not out of spite, but out of precision. I wanted this to be clean. It wasn't the first time I'd been underestimated in my own building. I'd bought this place 3 years ago, after working 2 jobs and saving for almost a decade. It wasn't a fancy building, just a small 3-story house converted into units, but it was mine, and I took care of it. I fixed the leaks, painted the walls, handled disputes, and tried to build a place where people respected one another. But sometimes, people forget where they are. Sometimes they believe they're bigger than the place that shelters them. And sometimes, they push just a little too far. These 3 had been a problem from day one. Loud parties. Complaints from the neighbor upstairs. One of them once yelled at the mailman for delivering someone else's package late. Another tried to drill a shelf into a load-bearing wall. I had warned them, politely, twice. Then I sent a formal notice. Still, I gave them space. I thought maybe they'd settle. Maybe stress was making them act out. But now, showing up at my door to give me a deadline to vacate. That was a new level of arrogance. The next morning, I printed out their signed contracts, highlighted the relevant sections, and stapled them to individual letters addressed to each of them. The letters stated that due to repeated violations of the lease agreement and attempted intimidation of the landlord, their tenancy was under review. I slid them under their doors. I knew they'd be confused, and that's exactly what happened. Around noon, the tall one came banging on my door. This time, his face wasn't calm. It was red, tight with frustration. "What is this?" he said, waving the paper. I looked at him, still calm, still quiet, and said, "It's your lease. You might want to read it. Page 2, paragraph 3, and also the definition of the word landlord." His mouth opened, then closed. The woman behind him whispered something like, "Wait, you're the landlord." I nodded once. Slowly, the air changed. You could feel it. The false confidence they had yesterday vanished, replaced with confusion, embarrassment, and something else, fear. Because they had made demands from someone who didn't owe them anything. They had delivered threats without leverage, and now they were realizing the ground they stood on wasn't theirs. I told them we could speak again in the evening, if they wanted to go over the violations, but for now, I had nothing more to say. I closed the door, again gently, again quietly, and for the first time since that knock the day before, I allowed myself to smile, because the truth was, people like them never expect someone like me to have power, and I don't blame them. The world doesn't teach us to look beyond appearances, but I had built this life brick by brick. And I wasn't about to let a few loud mouths shake it. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want drama. I just wanted respect. And now they were going to learn what happens when you try to evict the landlord from his own home. That evening, as promised, I waited in the kitchen, papers spread out in front of me like evidence in a quiet courtroom. I didn't know if they'd actually show up, but I had everything ready just in case. Then, at around 6:45, there was a knock, not aggressive this time, just hesitant, almost careful. I opened the door and saw all three of them standing there, not as bold now, not as sure of themselves. The tall guy spoke first, voice quieter than before. "Can we talk?" I nodded and stepped aside. They walked in, looking around like they were seeing my place for the first time, even though we'd passed each other in the hallways for months. I gestured toward the chairs, and we sat down. No tension, no yelling, just silence. The kind that makes you think before speaking. I let them start. The woman cleared her throat. "Look, we didn't know you were the landlord. We thought you were just another tenant." She paused, waiting for me to say something, but I didn't. The man next to her jumped in. "We're sorry. That letter we were frustrated. There've been some issues, and we didn't handle them right." I could tell they weren't used to apologizing, but at least they were trying. I picked up their leases and placed them on the table. "You signed these," I said calmly. "You agreed to the terms. And since moving in, you've broken several of them." I slid one lease toward the tall guy. "Hosting parties past quiet hours." I pointed to the second. "Drilling into walls without approval." And the third, "Yelling at neighbors." And then showing up at my door, trying to force me out. The room went quiet again, this time, with the weight of consequences sitting in the air. I didn't retaliate, I continued. "I didn't fine you, didn't file reports. I let it slide. But when you try to intimidate me when you stand at my door and give me a deadly eye, don't stay quiet." They looked at each other. The woman nodded slightly. "You're right, we were out of line." That's all I needed to hear. I wasn't interested in making enemies. I just wanted them to respect the space and the people in it. "You've got two options," I said. "One, you follow the lease. From now on, no more noise, no more chaos, and you stay for the duration of your contract. TY file for eviction and let the legal system decide." They didn't even take a second to respond. "We'll stay in line," the tall guy said. "No more problems." The others nodded. I believed him. Partly because I think they were shocked to learn the truth, and partly because they finally understood that just because someone's quiet doesn't mean they're powerless. They left a few minutes later, quieter, more thoughtful. I closed the door behind them, still calm, but now tired, not just from the conversation, but from the constant need to prove that I deserved to be here. Later, that night, I sat in bed thinking about how close it had come. If I'd been someone else, someone who didn't own the property, someone without backup, they might have gotten their way. It made me think about how many people get pushed around like that, simply because others assume they won't push back. I wasn't going to let that be my story. Over the next few days, things settled. No noise, no drama. They passed me in the hallway with polite nods, kept to themselves, even offered to help carry groceries once. I didn't need their friendship, just their respect. And now, I had it. But the story didn't end there. A week later, I got a call from one of the other tenants, a young woman on the second floor. She said she'd overheard the same group talking in the stairwell. They were making new plans, talking about trying to organize the other tenants to demand changes. One even joked about getting rid of the owner again, just a little more quietly this time. I wasn't surprised. Some people can't help themselves. They see any form of structure or authority as something to be broken. I thanked her for the call, hung up, and pulled out the same binder from before. This time, I didn't write warnings. I didn't ask for conversations. I submitted formal notices of lease violation, and I attached the complaint from the other tenant, signed and dated. I dropped them off that evening, just like before, quietly, without drama. I didn't need to knock. I just needed the system to do its work. Within 2 weeks, 2 of them gave notice voluntarily. The third one tried to argue but realized quickly that he didn't have a leg to stand on. By the end of the month, their unit was empty, that I walked through it after they left. It was messy, of course. A few holes in the walls, some junk left behind. But it was quiet, and it felt like the house could breathe again. I stood there, listening to nothing. No yelling, no footsteps above my head. Just stillness, peace. I had learned something important through all of it. People will test you. They will try to move you from your place not because you're wrong, but because they think you're weak. And sometimes, you have to let them speak. Let them assume. Let them underestimate you. So that when the truth finally hits them, it hits hard. I fixed up the unit over the next week. Repainted the walls, patched up the damage, replaced a broken doorknob. It wasn't glamorous work, but it reminded me why I'd bought this place in the first place. Not just to live in, but to build something stable, something strong. A home that couldn't be taken from me just because someone decided they didn't like who was living in it. And when I finally posted the listing for new tenants, I added a new clause to the lease, one that made it absolutely clear who owned the property, who ran it, and that if anyone ever thought about delivering eviction threats again, they might want to check whose name is on the deed first. A month after they left, the house felt different, not just quieter but lighter, like it had shed a layer of tension. I'd replaced the locks, cleaned out every corner of the unit they'd occupied, and added a security camera in the main hallway, not for surveillance, but for peace of mind. I didn't expect more trouble, but I'd learned my lesson. Stay calm. Stay quiet, but never stay unaware. Soon after, I interviewed potential tenants. Young professionals, a retired couple, even a student doing her master's. I didn't rush the process. I wanted people who respected not just the space, but the community it came with. And surprisingly, a few had already heard about the previous drama. Word spreads fast in small neighborhoods, and when it does, the truth usually travels with it, especially when it ends in your favor. One of the applicants, a middle-aged man with calm eyes and a firm handshake, said something that stuck with me. As we walked through the freshly painted unit, he looked around and said, "This feels like a place someone cares about." I smiled, because that's exactly what it was. And maybe that's why the former tenants couldn't stand me, because I cared too much for them to walk all over it. He moved in 2 weeks later. Quiet, respectful, always on time with rent. We'd exchange a few words at the mailbox. Nothing too deep, but always polite. The kind of tenant every landlord hopes for. Slowly, the house started to feel like it was breathing again, not just still, but alive in the right way. But even with the peace restored, the memory of that knock, that Sunday deadline, stayed with me. I thought about it often, not out of bitterness, but reflection. What would have happened if I hadn't owned the place? If I hadn't stood my ground? Would I have packed my things and left my own home because 3 strangers decided I didn't belong? That's the part that haunts me, not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been made to feel like a guest in their own life. People assume power comes from being the loudest, the most aggressive. But power isn't about noise. It's about knowing where you stand, and refusing to be moved unless you decide to move. And in this case, I didn't move, I stayed. And they left. One night, a few months later, I got a letter in the mail. No return address. Just my name on the front, handwritten. Inside was a single page, no signature. But the handwriting matched one of the former tenants. It read, "We were wrong. You handled it better than we would have. Hope the place is quieter now." No apology. Exactly. But enough. Enough to know they'd thought about it. Enough to know I hadn't just vanished from their story. I'd changed the ending. I folded the letter, placed it in the back of my lease binder, and forgot about it. Not because it wasn't meaningful, but because I didn't need their validation. I had already won. Sometimes I walk past that part of the hallway where they confronted me. I don't do it intentionally. It's just the way to the laundry room. But I always notice it. I always remember how 3 people, full of assumptions and arrogance, tried to push me out of my own home, and how they failed because they had no idea who they were dealing with. I learned that when people underestimate you, they expose their own weakness. They show you where they think the cracks are. And if you stay calm, just calm enough to watch, to wait, to choose your moment, you'll know exactly when and how to respond. That lesson has served me in more places than just my house. It's changed how I carry myself at work, in meetings, in public. People still judge. Some still assume I'm just a tenant, just a quiet guy from nowhere. That's fine, let them. Because when the time comes, I know what I hold. I know the strength I own, and I know the deed is in my name. A few neighbors eventually asked about the old tenants. Did they break their lease? Did something happen? I just smile and say, they moved on. No need to explain. Let the house keep its dignity. Let the walls forget the noise. But I remember, not because I'm angry, but because that experience reminded me that ownership isn't just about paperwork. It's about presence. About standing your ground even when others try to shake it. It's about knowing who you are and not needing anyone else to confirm it. They wanted me out by Sunday. They thought if they pushed hard enough, if they were loud enough, I'd back down. But I wasn't going anywhere. I was the landlord. I was the one who paid the mortgage, who fixed the pipes, who cleaned the gutters, and showed up when no one else did. This was my home, and no deadline, no knock, no threat could change that. Now, every Sunday feels different, calmer, stronger. A quiet reminder that I faced a storm in my own hallway and stayed standing. That I didn't need to shout to be heard. That sometimes, the softest voice holds the firmest ground. And when I look out the front window and see the new neighbors walking their dogs, kids riding bikes, someone planting flowers along the sidewalk, I smile. Because I know they're here, not just because of a good location or affordable rent. They're here because the home is protected, cared for, on not just in paperwork, but in presence. They wanted me out by Sunday, but I stayed. Because this house, this life, it's mine.